Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you're listening or calling in from. If you're listening to a live webinar on today, December 7th, 2017, and would like to earn ASHA CEUs for this course, be sure to attend the entire 1-hour session. The handout and all the forms you need to complete to obtain CE credit will be emailed to you after the webinar, and actually they also appear as attachments on your reminder email. Mail the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form to the address shown at the bottom of this slide. Be sure and mail it. We cannot accept an emailed form. The forms must be postmarked no later than December 18th, 2017. If you happen to have more than one person listening in at your location, be sure to download the attendance sheet and have each person requesting CEU sign the sheet and complete the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form. You don't need to submit an attendance sheet if you're the only one at your location listening in. No CEUs are offered for the recording of this session available on the website. With that being taken care of, let's move right on into our session. I'd like to introduce Dr. Adam Scheller.
Thanks, Nancy. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Hopefully you're all excited about the next hour as much as I am. Thanks for coming. We're going to have a conversation today about the PLS-5 and CELF Preschool-2. Really my main purpose today is to give you a good overview of why you would choose one versus the other, and I'm going to do that through case studies. I do have some specific test information that I'm going to review, but I do want to look over some case studies to give you a sense of where we're going. Now, I know that this format doesn't really help us interact very well. I mean, it's hard to interact virtually like this, but what I'd like you to do is get familiar with the little chat box that's on the bottom left of your screen, because I'm going to ask a bunch of questions throughout today, and I'd like you to put some answers in there. And if you have something specific you want to ask, go ahead and do that. If I can't answer it or I don't see it, because there are a lot of you on the line today, maybe Nancy can get to it if she's going to be on the line. But we'll try to answer all your questions and interact the best that we can. So welcome again. Just a quick disclosure, I am an employee of Pearson. It's pretty straightforward. I just want to let you know that we are going to only be talking about the PLS and CELF, and those are published by Pearson. So oftentimes what I hear, I do see some messages coming through about audio quality. If audio quality continues to be an issue, a lot of times it is the bandwidth coming through on your end of the internet. So what happens is whatever internet traffic happens, it slows down our audio. So feel free to, on the bottom top left of the screen, I believe, because my screen looks different, there's a pause button. Feel free to pause that, wait a couple seconds, maybe about 10 seconds, and then restart. And what that'll do is basically restart your audio and basically sync it back up. So let me know if that's a continuing issue. Also, our chairperson, Sherry Locken, will, if you have a problem, can put in a specific phone number that you can call in if you continue to have audio issues. So this is our agenda today. We have an ambitious hour. We are going to, as I mentioned, really talk about both of these assessments because they are complementary, and it's important that when you're analyzing or determining what type of assessment you need to give for a specific referral or for a specific child, that you choose the right one. These tests are different, even though we're looking at very similar constructs across both assessments. Even though we are looking at the evaluation of language, a comprehensive language assessment, they were developed differently, and as such, they are sometimes better used for certain populations than others. It's the nature of having multiple assessments, so we need to have variety and make sure that when we're picking something out that makes sense, we're doing so based on the psychometrics of the test, based on what the test was developed for, and based on what it's best used for, right? So that's the way that toolkits really function, making sure that when you have something, you pull out the right one for that specific referral question. These are basically the learning objectives that we will talk about. We may stray here and there and try to include a little bit more in there, but this is what you're going to use for the ASHA CE completion. So let's first start talking about the PLS-5 Preschool Language Skills 5th edition. First of all, let's go over what it can be used for. A lot of times tests do have a general or a wide net. They can be cast on a wide range of needs and for assessment purposes. But let's focus in on the real important ones given your population. So this is a test that has a pretty wide age range. We could use it from birth all the way through 7 years, 11 months. And that was extended in this most recent edition for those of you who are familiar with the PLS-4. It's used primarily to determine the presence of a language delay or disorder. So it can help you determine whether or not a child has receptive and or expressive language disorders, or possibly a combination of both. And it's really helpful and useful and strategic and accurate when we're trying to determine eligibility for early intervention or even speech and language services as children transition into school age. It is an identification process. We're looking at expressive and receptive language skills, but we're looking in the areas across a large spectrum, a large continuum. We're looking in the areas of attention, gesture, play, vocal development, social communication, which again you think of as being a higher order or a more developed skill, vocabulary, concepts, language structure, integrative language, how are they integrating that language into their daily life and how are they integrating it, various components into their expression and their reception, and also emergent literacy. So that emergent literacy, depending on the age of kids that you're seeing, will be or will not be used. You know, it's an assessment process, or some of the questions that come out are going to be for older kids. We're going to be looking at the emergence of literacy, not necessarily what level of skill a child has. It is very helpful at identifying strengths and weaknesses. So, to apply an assessment, I always, if any of you have heard me speak or teach on assessment before, one of my main messages is always scores are almost meaningless unless you use them in context. And scores are only a part of an assessment process, right? So a score will help you determine the presence of language disorder or the presence of disorder in general, will help you understand strengths and weaknesses. But it's a second application that really makes an assessment much more meaningful. So how do you apply test data to intervention? How do you bridge the gap between assessment and intervention? When we look at the profile for the PLS-5, you can see here this chart shows us a really great way to conceptualize the development of skills across time or over time. And what you see in this slide and the next slide are the development of auditory comprehension across age, right? So if you're looking here, you can see down at the youngest of age, you see 0 through 2 months, we're looking at attention to, I can't read sideways, attention to environment, sorry about that, attention to people. We're looking then, going down a little bit further, we're still measuring attention in 3 to 5 month olds, but also looking at play. And as we get to 9 to 11 month olds, we're looking at gesture as well, and then developing vocabulary and connected speech as we get into 1 through 1.5 months. So it's interesting as we think about assessment like this that we should be looking about and thinking about the development or the process of the development of language across time, right? So that's really what these items are going to be measuring in different ages. And you can see here, this is from 3 years, 5 months, all the way through 7 years, 11 months. So we see a lot of this in how this is going. So when we're thinking about measurement and we're thinking about the items that we're using, we should be very aware that each of these items will start to, item 1 will be at an easier level or a less complex developmental level than item 30. Right, so we're thinking across the spectrum of development. So I do have, there are some folks that are coming through that are having difficulty with audio. I don't know, could you put the number and the code in the chat box, please, either Nancy or Sherry? Thank you. I apologize for that, but you can call into that on a phone line and hear much clearer if you're having internet connectivity issues. Additionally, if we think about the PLS-5, it does have 1 month norms for 2-6 through 2-11. Why is that important? Well, it's important for thinking about those children who are transitioning from early intervention to school services. A lot of times the assessment happens, or the assessment is initiated between that time range. Right? So if we're looking at a child who is 2 years, 10 months, and we're using the norms of a 2-year, 6-month-old, that 6-month norm interval potentially inflates scores. So we think about that as, if we're thinking it will be a potential inflation because we're measuring 4-month gap based on earlier norms. So this really allows us to think about the PLS-5 as being more important or an effective tool for this age range, even more important or more effective, because we can now think about it in terms of 1-month intervals. So we can then compare a child to his or her age group within that 6-month range. So it is important to think about that. It's best practice to really think about using as close to norms as possible. Now, all tests can't be developed with such short norm ranges, but we did identify that this is an area that's really important, and it really helps for that range to look in more detail. If you want to think about the sensitivity and specificity of the test, really this is a pretty cool little example that I put together. It's hypothetical, right? But thinking about using the PLS-5 and can it help me if I'm taking out a case, and you'll see a case in a second, can it help me identify language disorder? So if we think about it in terms of sensitivity and specificity, and I use the 1.5 standard deviation cutoff, which would be a standard score of 78, which is typical for early intervention. So if I know it's not the same across the country, but a lot of areas, a lot of states, a lot of regions will use the 1.5 standard deviation cutoff. If we use that cutoff and we have a language disorder with an approximate prevalence of 10%, so that's generally about what we're looking at, about 10% of the population being identified with a disorder. Now I know that ranges, but if we're using language disorder, we're just hypothesizing here. The PLS-5 will identify positive test results. It will give positive test results to 2,520 and negative test results to 7,480. That's out of a sample of 10,000 people. So essentially what we're looking at here is we're looking at a test that is very sensitive and very specific at how it identifies. So you can feel very confident in using the PLS-5 to properly identify a language disorder when one is present, and negatively identify or not identify a language disorder when one is not present. The difficulty is when you're thinking about a young age, there's a lot of variability. So you always have to keep that in mind whenever you pull out any test, that there's going to be a number of students who are identified positively even when they're not, when they don't have a disorder. It's, again, because of the nature of variability in early childhood, particularly with language, as we see the development range pretty significantly or sway pretty significantly even within 6 months of time. So keep that in mind. That's very important. But the PLS-5 is very accurate at identifying language disorders. So let's think about this. Let's start thinking about the PLS-5 through a case study. Let's think about Brock. Again, this is a made-up case, guys, so there's no personally identifiable information here. But I thought that was a really cute little picture. So he looks a lot like my son. We'll think about Brock, who is 2 years, 10 months of age. So if we think about Brock, he was assessed with the PLS-5 in June 13th of 2011. His birth date was August 13th of 2008, so that makes him 2 years and 10 months of age. And here are our initial results. So if we think about auditory comprehension and expressive communication, and as well as the total language score, I'm going to give you a minute to look at this. I want to give you a minute to look these scores over and see if there's anything here that stands out to you. What are you starting to think about with scores such as this? And again, feel free to put some comments in the chat box. We can have an interactive conversation as much as possible. We see that, let me talk about them while you're looking this over, but we see that this child has an auditory comprehension score of 70 with a range, a 90% confidence interval range of 66 to 79. We see that this child's expressive communication score of 67, the range of 63 to 75. And the same is true for total language with a range of 63 to 74. So if you're thinking about it, so I see several people putting it looks like a significant language delay. Robin's noting that looks like he has a moderately delayed receptive and expressive language. It's true, right? So if we're thinking about this, see significant, looks delayed in both. So if you're thinking about this in general, right, where if we use that cutoff of 78 and below would be considered a 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. In any situation, this child would likely given these results, qualify for early intervention services. If we go a step further, we can think about, so let me move past this one, sorry. If we go a step further, it is important for us to, the next step, whenever we process these types of scores, is to think about discrepancy comparisons. So even though, this is common practice, and this is a caution that I want to make sure I give you, even though we see a slight difference between scores, it's important that we analyze that difference to determine whether or not, first of all, whether or not it's statistically significant, and second of all, whether or not that difference is rare. Now, you can hypothesize with only a 3-point difference here, this youngster, Brock, his skills are pretty commensurate. So his auditory and expressive communication are both delayed. But it's important that that step be done consistently and systematically. And the way that we do that is by looking at discrepancy comparisons. So for this child, we can see that, PLS-5, we can see that the difference between AC and EC is only 3 points. The critical value, and all this information is found in the manual. You can see the tables listed down here below. But the critical value is 11 points. So if that difference was 11 points, we would then be considering that a statistically significant difference, right? Since in this case it's not, it's only 3 points, we know that it is not a significant difference, and therefore we're really not worried about whether or not it is rare or not. But hopefully everybody feels this process feels confident with this type of a process, because it's important that we do this step. So in Brock's case, we have good data here that's showing us that this child has difficulties with both auditory and expressive communication. So that's the step that we should engage in next. The next chart that we see down here at the bottom shows us this child's growth scale value. Okay, so this is the first time I'm giving this test. Let me set the stage for you on this one. This is the first time I'm giving this child a test. This child is 2 years and 10 months of age. It's likely with this level, again, as I mentioned, with this level of skill or this level of development, that he'll probably qualify for services, and we should probably start to engage in some type of intervention, probably pretty intensive for this youngster. And we'll be giving assessments again from the next time. Why is that important? Well, it's important that we have accurate data to track progress over time. So for Brock, in this case, as a two-year-old, I'm probably going to start giving, it may not be me if I'm working in intervention. If this child transitions over to school services, they're probably going to be giving this assessment again at a later date. And it's so important that we accurately interpret progress. And the way that we do that is by looking at something like the growth scale value in combination with the standard scores. Let me show you a process about how that works. Growth scale values are a representation of actual skill development over time, and they are developmental in nature. So they change depending on the skill that you're looking at. So for example, if I were to look at something like reading, you know that reading, children increase in reading skill much quicker at the early grades, and at the later grades, they still continue to increase in their reading ability, but they tend to flatten out. So the curve flattens out for them. So you would expect a higher acquisition or a higher change in growth scale value at the earlier grades. The same can be true. Same is true for language. Language development occurs much quicker at the younger ages and sort of flattens out as the child gets older, and then increases again when it goes more into the language, when it goes more into a language or social language domains. So we expect to see some variability there. So the growth scale value will show you how much change that child has made. The difficulty, though, is determining whether or not they've made change that's significant or change that is meaningful. The way that you transfer that or the way that you think about that is by thinking about the growth scale values. So in Brock's case, it is important that in that case, he was a youngster. It's the first time we gave him. But the next time they give it to him, it's important for then that person to think about the growth scale values. And you analyze it in combination with the standard score. So let me show you that. The standard score changes across time as the norm sample changes. So it's dependent on how fast or how slow the typical or the population develop a skill. So in this case here, in the first case, we see at time 1 the child got an auditory comprehension score of 79 and a GSV score of 492. Even though that's not below the cutoff, let's not worry about that right now. When we go to time 2, we can see that this child's score, whatever it is, a year later, a year and a half later, this child's score in auditory comprehension increased to 85, and their growth scale value increased to 520. Now, what that means is that this child increased in auditory comprehension. Their auditory comprehension developed from time 1 to time 2. And we can see that because the growth scale value increased from time 1 to time 2. But we also know that this child increased or acquired auditory comprehension skills faster than their peer group. And the way that we see that is because the standard score increased from time 1 to time 2. So you see how powerful this is. We can not only analyze how much a person's skill increased, but we can also determine how fast they increased compared to their peer group. So let me show you another example. This expressive communication score of 75 and a GSV of 482. And we see at time 2, the standard score remained at 75 and the growth scale value went up to 515. Well, this case, in this scenario, we see that the child's expressive communication improved from time 1 to time 2 because we see a 15, 25, 32-point increase, but the standard score stayed the same. So what that means, the way that you would interpret this is by saying, yes, this child's expressive communication increased, but it increased at the same rate as their peers, and they're still well below the average for their age. 75 is below the cutoff for in most situations where you'd identify a language disorder. So in this situation, yes, they're increasing, but they're just not increasing fast enough compared to their peers. Let me go over a couple more scenarios to make this point, because I can't really stress enough how important or how strong growth scale values can be over time to look at progress. In this example, we see a standard score of 85 and a growth scale value of 427. And in time 2, we see a standard score of 79 and a growth scale value of 460. So for auditory comprehension, yes, this child's developed from time 1 to time 2, but they're developing slower than their peer groups. And we see that by a reduction in standard score from time 1 to time 2. So it's important to recognize that the growth scale value is independent of the progress that the norm group is making, but the standard score is dependent on that. So we can actually see skill development from time 1 to time 2. So yes, our intervention is working, but this child is just not developing fast enough, and they're falling further and further behind their peers. So I would be much more concerned with this type of a profile, falling further and further behind. And finally, the last one I'll just show you here just to drive this point home, which is the final 2 scenarios, which is a standard score that decreases from time 1 to time 2 and a growth scale value that stays the same, meaning that this child did not increase in any expressive communication skills from time 1 to time 2, and they're falling further and further from behind their peers. And this last one really is probably more indicative of a head injury or serious medical condition, hospitalization for a prolonged amount of time, where they actually lose skills. And so we see the difference between growth scale values that actually went down. So that's the real importance, and the reason I show you that at the end of Brock's case example is because it's important to think about those children as they're transitioning between early intervention and school services, or even within your own service level, that you analyze whether or not that child improves from time 1 to time 2. So finally, for this youngster, Brock, we would look at the articulation screener, and we see that this child got a raw score of 5 for the articulation screener. And if we analyze that for a 2-year, 10-month-old, we would go across, and a score of 5 indicates that further evaluation is indicated. It's right about in the middle, but at the same time, it does tell us that there's some issues with Brock's articulation that we should look at in more detail. Remember that this is just a screener. It's not comprehensive, but this level at the PLS-5, if we're looking at Brock, we should really think about doing an additional articulation screener after that. Now, it's up to you. You know, I know some people may say this child has a mixed expressive receptive language disorder. Let's work on that, and not, articulation will come maybe. I know there are some conflicting opinions on that, but at the same time, it's important for us to think about the total child here. So I did have a question that came through just clarifying GSV. The question is, the GSV is showing developmental milestone growth and is independent of standardized comparisons to peers. That is correct, Heather. It is independent of the norm group. So it is actually looking at the skill development from time 1 to time 2 rather than how that performance compares to peer groups. Good question. All right, let's think about the CELF Preschool-2, and let's compare the 2 tests, and then we'll think about some case studies with this one so that we can think about the differences here, right? So let me go back real quick just to think about it. Just to show it more. So if we look at a profile like this is likely a child that has had or has experienced pretty significant difficulties with language. So this is a child who's probably known, right? We know the differences, right? The children who have pretty significant language disorders or disorders in general, they tend to be known earlier and earlier. So this looks like a profile of a child who comes to us who we know has some pretty significant weaknesses. The PLS-5 is absolutely set up well to measure that. It has a real low floor. It has a pretty nicely developed ceiling. So we can actually go pretty far down and look at kids that are pretty low functioning. So you can feel very confident that when you're testing a low kid like Brock in this case, that you can actually get scores or actually give items that will be measured. So that's really the trade-off, right? We need to make sure that whenever we're pulling out a test, that if we're using it on a child who's low functioning, that it will actually measure something so that we're not just getting raw scores of 0. We need to get some type of raw score. We need to get the child to be able to access and take some of the items. So this is really well set up for that. So you can see this profile really fits well for the PLS-5. You can use it for a lower functioning child. So for the CELF Preschool-2, this is the first slide on there, we're looking at receptive language. We're looking at listening and auditory comprehension. We're also looking at expressive language, overall expressive language skills. Additionally, we have the ability to look at language content, so looking at the semantic development for vocabulary, concept development, comprehension of word associations and relationships, comprehension of simple and complex sentences, and we're also able to think about language structure. So it's an overall measure of the ability to interpret and produce word and sentence structure. So if you can think about, I really want you to start thinking about this, the differences between the descriptions that I gave you of the PLS-5 and the CELF Preschool-2. It seems that, and I'm just going to kind of lay this foreshadowing, obviously, we're looking at some skills here that are more developmentally complex. So keep that in mind as we think about our case study. Here's the same slide that I showed you for the PLS-5, just looking at the sensitivity and specificity for language disorder in the same situation. So this is slightly different, though. I'm looking at a -1 standard deviation cutoff. So that would be in the below average range. So it would be 85 and below, with the same prevalence, 10%. In this situation, we're seeing that it's positively identifying 850, and it's positively not identifying 8,200 out of a sample of 10,000 people. So again, this is another example of a test that is very well developed at identifying language disorder and non-language disorders. And as this, if you were to decrease this standard deviation cutoff, the sensitivity would increase. So essentially, what you're seeing there is it would increase as the child's disorder was more significant. When we're looking at a test like the CELF, those of you who are familiar with the CELF and who have used other measures or other tests in the CELF family know that the test was developed by Elizabeth Wigg and Wayne Secord to look at assessment at various levels. So think about it in terms of 4 levels. The first level is identifying whether or not there is a language disorder. The second level is to look at the nature of the disorder. The third one is to look at early classroom and literacy fundamentals. And then the fourth one is to think about language and communication and context. And essentially, if you think about this is, what is this but a reflection of best practice of assessment going from general to more specific, right? We're looking at child's development. We're looking at general questions of disorder. We're looking at more specific questions of nature. And then we're looking at even more specific questions related to context and ability to function in the classroom. So it's important for us to really think about applying the CELF or evaluating the CELF in this context. So here's our case study. Here's our first case study. I'm going to go over 2 if I have time. Our first case study for the PLS-5 is a male. He's 3 years and 7 months of age. He was previously diagnosed with a mixed receptive expressive language disorder. That was a month ago. Wait a second. No, that's incorrect. That should have been 2 years. I apologize for that. That should have been 2 years, 6 months. And at the time of the evaluation, he was receiving services from speech, OT, and PT, speech language, OT, and PT. So let's think about it in the context of that overall assessment process that I just mentioned earlier, those 4 steps. So level 1 is to look at the core language index for this child. We see that this child's core language index is 69, okay? You see it right there, with a confidence interval of 62 to 76, and that's at the 90% confidence interval. The tests that were administered were the sentence structure, which is a 4, word structure, and expressive vocabulary at a 7. So let's think about our first question. Our first question is, does the child have a language disorder? And do we have evidence to support that decision? Well, that seems pretty straightforward. I think we do have some evidence to support that. If we're looking at the core language index, it's a great way for us to predict language disorder, and it's a great test for us, or a great measure for us to use as structured data for that, right? So this child's score of 69 shows that he's pretty far below his peer group. So in this context, with this test in the specific context, it's likely that he continues to have a language disorder. Level number 2, what is the nature of this disorder? And I'm just going to let that hang for a second and let you hypothesize that. So go ahead and throw some responses in the chat box. We have a receptive language index of 73, expressive language 73, language content 79, and language structure of 67. Let me let that hang there for a second. Go ahead and throw some of your answers in the chat box. What is the nature of this child's disorder? Do we have evidence for it here? Right. We have Lori said it's receptive and expressive. Heather saying articulation affecting language structure. Looks like moderately delayed skills in both areas from Robin. Yep, Sharon saying receptive, expressive. All right, so we're saying a lot of folks agreeing that we're seeing information here that's consistent with both receptive and expressive language disorder, so a mix. All right, so what we see here is when we're thinking about the differences between receptive and expressive language, the scores are identical, and there is not a statistically significant difference. When we're thinking about language content versus language structure, there is a 12-point difference. So that 12-point difference is significant at the 0.05 level, and its frequency is 9.9. So the way that I interpret that is by saying that this difference between language content and language structure, and let me just remind myself, yes, language content is higher. So this difference between language content and language structure is showing that language content is significantly higher than language structure, and also it's rare. So that difference is clinically significant because it's below 15%, and it's statistically significant. So that's an important finding. What do we do with that? Well, if we think further about this, yes, the receptive expressive skills are commensurate with one another. So we can identify that mixed receptive expressive disorder is probably present there based on this data. But the language content is a relative strength compared to language structure. Language content and structure are both delayed. So if you think about it that way, it gives us some additional information. We're getting some additional information, and we're able to think about that content score as being a strength of this youngster. But the structure is still really problematic. To go one step further, we're thinking about early classroom and literacy skills. We look at recalling sentences in context. This child's score was below the 1st to the 24th percentile, which would be a problem, which would be problematic. That's a low score. And the pre-literacy rating scale, they did not meet the criterion there as well. So this is a child who in this situation, it's probably, yes, we're going to experience classroom difficulties, obviously, because of the nature and the severity of their disorder. But we don't have pre-literacy really issues at this time, but the recalling sentences, the overall language memory is problematic. So if we think about it, scores in both areas are low, but what kind of recommendations would we make for this youngster? Anybody have any ideas? What kind of a recommendation do you think that you would make? Based on the findings that we just talked about, what would you recommend for this guy?
Oh, wow, lots. That came up very quickly. I think a bunch of yours came through at the same time, and I just saw like a big explosion of comments, which is good. Language intervention and maybe some classroom accommodations, direct language therapy. Yes. Oh, I had a good one. Phyllis asked the question. Well, all of them are good, so don't let me discount your response. But Phyllis asked an interesting question, which is, wouldn't we need to see specific error patterns to select objectives? I would agree to that. I would agree that we would need to see that and probably go in a little more detail to think about those recommendations. I think in general, though, you're right. A lot of folks are making comments looking at speech services, looking for understanding, repeating instructions, trying to determine how they performed on those tests. Those are some really good suggestions, folks. I think that's pretty consistent. Yeah, but looking at those details or those error patterns in more detail, Phyllis, would be a great process. Semantic skill building, building vocabulary, all very good recommendations. Thanks for participating. So in this situation, I do want to tell you that the pragmatic profile was not administered. Why do you think that it wasn't administered? Anybody have any thoughts about why in this case, thinking about the profile that we just looked at, why we would not administer the pragmatics profile? Or would you? Was that an error? Should I have included the pragmatics profile here? Robin made a really, really to-the-point comment. The therapist did not have any concerns in this area. That's absolutely true, Robin. So in that situation, you may want to think about, let's think about what else, let me see what else other people are putting in here. Probably did not use enough language to do the profile based on the low scores we've seen. Child is too young. Yeah, so no deficit evident. Absolutely, folks. So this is the process of what everybody's putting in the chat box is absolutely true. It's, yes, we probably didn't see any concerns, but at the same time, it's probably too low for us to identify this. So keep that in mind. I always say don't force something, right? So if we don't need to look at language pragmatics, if we don't need to talk about social pragmatics because we're so concerned about other areas, we don't need to force that evaluation. So in this case, it's absolutely appropriate and justified to not go this extra step because we have other things to focus on. It's likely that it's just we don't have enough data to be even to be able to even identify the pragmatics disorder at this point. It's likely, yeah, he's going to have difficulty with pragmatics because he has difficulty with language in general. So, yeah, so just think about it that way. Don't force something if we don't need it. All right, let's think about this next case study. We still have some time, and then I have some pretty cool slides at the end that will help us differentiate between when we should use really the main differences between the two tests and think about when we should use one versus the other. But I'm hoping that it's becoming more clear to you as we look at these case studies, the types of information that we should think about. So for this case, we're looking at a child who's a little bit older. We're going to take out the CELF Preschool-2 for a female. She's 6 years and 1 month of age. She just started first grade. She was previously diagnosed with a moderate to severe language disorder at 5 years, 4 months using the TOL P3. She is currently identified with a CD and LD, communication and language disorders, or learning disorders, she receives services from an LD teacher, speech and language, and OT. So let's think about the same process, and then we'll go into the differences, really. So the core language score, again, here is 63. We see a confidence interval of 56 to 70. Sentence structure, word structure, 3. Expressive vocabulary, 4. So again, if we think about does this child have a language disorder, I think that those scores absolutely support the continued diagnosis here. Identification. If we think about the nature of the disorder, we have a child with a receptive language index of 83, an expressive language index of 65, language content of 79, and language structure of 65. So again, let's think about what that means. What are those differences? Are those differences significant? Do they show us anything more detail? Do they give us more information about what the pattern is or what the strengths and weaknesses are? Right. So, I had a question that came through. Is CD a cognitive disorder? No, that would be a communication disorder. So the cognitive disorder I would have put down as probably ID. Sorry about that. So if we think about the differences here, I do see a question that came through about whether or not this test can be used for really young students with concerns of autism. Terry, I'll get to that in a minute, okay? I'll answer that in a little more detail in a minute. So if we look at this, we have a child with receptive skills that are statistically significant, statistically better, and clinically better than the expressive language scores. So that 18-point difference shows us that it's outside the realm of error and it's rare. So that's a pretty large difference between scores. And if, again, we look at language content versus language structure, we see, again, language content is much better for this child than language structure. So we see, again, 12-point differences, not only statistical, outside the realm of error, but also rare. So it occurs in a low percentage of the population. So, yeah, we see a lot of a really different pattern in this young child than we saw in the other child. We see receptive skills much better than expressive language skills. So it's a strength for this child, relatively. And they primarily have expressive language problems. Content is a relative strength compared to structure. But both language content and language structure are, again, both delayed. I had some pretty interesting comments come through as I was just speaking, but it means that she is approaching age-level receptive language, although she's still presented with delayed expressive language and will continue benefiting from services. It's typical of kids on the spectrum. That's an interesting comment, Gila. I think that's an interesting one for us to consider as we're thinking about this child. And another one came through. I wonder if that difference between receptive and expressive will even out as she matures. That's an interesting thought. Yeah, that's absolutely true. If we look at the subtest scores, we have sentence structure, word structure, expressive vocabulary, all pretty low. Concepts and following directions, word classes receptive, also expressive and total, all being fairly high, a little bit higher. Recalling sentences pretty low at 5. Classroom and early literacy skills for this youngster, basic concepts that did not meet criterion. In recalling sentences in context, the 1st to the 4th percentile, again, very low. Phonological awareness did not meet criterion. Pre-literacy rating scale, it did not meet criterion either. So scores in all areas are low. So there's a strength in using content of what she hears and weaknesses in the areas of mastery of the linguistic structure for rules for structure, so morphology and syntax. And this child has a significant weakness in recalling sentences that may be related to deficits in the area of language structure. Sorry, there should be an A right there. So I think that this process or this profile is a lot different. It really does show us a little bit more about how this child, even with not really affected receptive language, low but not really low, and how they perform in the classroom. So this is a child who's probably having some significant difficulties in the classroom, but they're probably in the classroom. So again, language and communication and context, the descriptive pragmatics profile, this child did not meet criterion. So that's an important finding as well. And in this situation, what would you recommend? I think it's an important thing to think about. What could be causing this difficulty? And the differences between the 3 kids that we just looked at or thought about. So over the course of the last 44 minutes, I've had some questions come through with which test do I recommend? Who could this be used for? Well, I'm going to ask that to you guys. I'm going to ask that to you guys at the end of this call, though. I'm not going to ask it right now. Keep that in mind, because I want you to think about what could potentially be causing this over time, right? What could potentially be affecting this from time 1 to time 2? I had a good question for this youngster, for this young woman. This test we're doing. Could expressive language be lower due to articulation? It's a good question. What do you all think? Anything that comes up that you would be concerned about? I think in some cases that could be a problem, right? Are they expressing themselves effectively? Because of articulation difficulties, they may not be doing it correctly, or they may not be putting themselves out there. It might be affected by anxiety at some point, or not being successful. It's a good question. It's something you should definitely think about. Let's see here. Let's move on to when to choose either one versus the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this. I'm going to go through what they look like and what we are going to be measuring differently. And then again, I'm going to put that question back out to you. What type of a case, based on the 3 that we've seen or based on some that you have familiarity with, do you think that you should be pulling this type of a test out for? So if we think about the correlation, this is the first place that I wanted to start, to think about the differences between the 2 tests and what we're measuring. we are not measuring the same exact things. If we were, we would see a 1.0 correlation across both tests. We never see that, right? Of course, we would never expect that because they're not the same test. But we do expect to see some similarities across the board that would show us what we're looking for, right? So essentially what we're thinking about here is we do see some differences between what we're measuring on auditory comprehension, expressive communication, and total language. And we can see that that's represented down here at the bottom. So really this is step one in saying that the two tests are slightly different. And again, I said that earlier, but I want to reiterate it, that we're taking out two different tools to measure very similar constructs across both, but we can really apply it more effectively if we're using them for certain populations or for certain purposes. So first, beyond that, think about what the referral question is. In this situation where you get a referral, early speech and language skills, if they're not acquired or have they acquired them at all, what are the gaps in developmental language skills? If you're thinking about that type of a question, the PLS-5 is a great test to pull out. If you're getting a question such as, is a preschool able to handle language in the classroom? What specific language skills is that preschooler missing? How is that affecting their performance in academics? That type of a question, the CELF Preschool-2 is more appropriate. So you could see the differences between these two tests. Absolutely see the differences. This situation indicates much more, much lower skills than this situation would, because there's something like this, the referral question over here on the right, you are already assuming this child's in a classroom. So this child can function in a classroom or is in a classroom, maybe having difficulties, of course, but that's really what we're looking at with the CELF Preschool-2. How are they doing in a classroom? What are we looking at there? The PLS-5 is a test that's much more, can be used in classroom settings, but is much more applicable or is much more effective when we're looking at kids who are probably on the lower end of the scale, a little bit lower functioning, right? It does incorporate emergent literacy, pre-literacy skills. It also does incorporate some theory of mind components. On the PLS-5, we could look at older kids, possibly on the spectrum, right? But in the context of kids who are having significant difficulties. So in those situations, we're able